Hey everyone, my name is Anson. In this video, I'm going to teach you all how to use TanStack query, or formerly known as React query. Now, I'm going to be calling it React query for the rest of this video, just because that's what I am used to, and many people still refer to it as React query. Regardless of its name, though, it is one of the most popular state management libraries out there, specifically when you want to use any data fetching library. So in other words, you usually will use React query in conjunction with a data fetching library, whether that's Axios or just the traditional built-in fetch API in the browser. Now, normally, if you don't want to use React query and if you want to manage your data fetching by yourself, and if you want to manage the state on its own for the data that is returned from the server, what you would do is you would fetch your data and then you would update some states, and then you would check to see if that state is defined or if it has any elements, assuming it's an array, and then you would render it to the document. Now, while that works, it still doesn't solve the issue of caching, retrying the network request, as well as refetching the data, because data can go stale all the time, and you want to be able to refetch that data when the user, let's say, leaves the browser tab and then comes back to it 10 minutes later, because by that time the data is stale, right? And those are a few problems that React query solves. There's a lot of other things that React query can do, and we're going to go ahead and dive into it in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is install React query, and that's pretty straightforward. We're going to go ahead into our repository. I'm going to type npm I, and then it's going to be at TanStack, so TAN stack STACK, and then /react-query. We're also going to work with the React query dev tools, and this will help us visualize our data. It'll help us debug any issues, things like that. If you've used Redux before, and if you're familiar with Redux dev tools, or if you've used other state management libraries that have their own dev tools, it's very, very similar. So let's do npm I at TanStack /react-query-dev tools. All right, and then we should be good to go. No more dependencies need to be installed. We're going to run our application. It is running on, let's see, port 5174. I might have another React app running. That's okay. So let's go over to the app. All right, so now let's go into our text editor and let's start writing some code. Let's start using React query. First thing that we want to do, of course, is set up React query. So we're going to go into our main.tsx file, and this might be named index.tsx, but for me, since I'm using Vite, it names it main.tsx by default. Wherever you are rendering the app, wherever you're mounting the app component to the root element in the document, is basically your entry point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a few things from the React query library. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So we want to import the query client provider and then query client. Okay. We're going to go ahead and first create an instance of query client, just like this. And then we're going to go ahead and take the query client provider, and we're going to wrap our app component inside the query client provider. So query client provider, and then app. So now every single component that is inside the app component, this is our root component. So every single component inside the app component will be able to use the features of React query. So we'll be able to use React query's APIs. You need to make sure that you are within the provider of the query client. Now, we're not done yet. We need to make sure we pass that query client instance as a prop to the provider. So we're going to pass this client prop and the instance of query client right over here. So now we can go into app.tsx, and now inside this component, I can go ahead and use the React query APIs. Now, the easiest thing that we can do now with React query is perform some GET requests. But I want to make it very clear that React query is not an HTTP data fetching library. It's just a wrapper that you can use to wrap your fetch requests or your Axios requests, or even if you're using GraphQL, you can even wrap those requests as well. And what it does is it wraps everything and it manages that state for you. So you don't have to manage it yourself. And you'll see in a second how that's going to look like. Before we proceed, though, let's actually enable the dev tools before I forget. So we're going to go into main.tsx and let's import React Query Dev Tools. And we want to make sure we import it from @TanStack /React-Query-Dev Tools. You saw that there were two. There was one for production, but we don't want that one. We want this one. And by default, it will be disabled for production. It's only going to be enabled if the node_env environment variable is set to development. Okay, and you can check more about that right over here. You can see it mentions that right over here, that dev tools are only enabled if this environment variable node_env is development. Okay, so now let's go ahead right over here inside the query client provider. And we're going to go ahead and render React Query Dev Tools just like that. And then initial is open. We'll set this to false. Okay. So let's go over here, and you can see that there's a button down over here. If I click on it, I get this user interface, and I can see a whole bunch of stuff. I can see queries, mutations. Obviously, nothing's happening right now, but let's go ahead and make some stuff happen. So let's go back into our code now, and let's import use query, just like that. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call useQuery. And remember, useQuery returns an object. Okay, it returns an object. We'll call this query. And the return type, let me see what's going on here. The return type should be of a type query result. And that's going to contain fields such as the data field, which is going to resolve into the response, the JSON response from the server, or whatever response that server's returning. Most cases, we'll just assume it's JSON for our example. Okay. There's also other fields too that you can access on the query object, such as the isLoading field, which will allow you to track the state of the network request call, so you'll know if we're still fetching, or if we're complete, or if the network request is canceled. There's also another field called error, which lets you know if there were any errors that happened when we called that fetch function. Okay? But now let's go ahead and inside this use query hook, we need to pass in some parameters. Or in our case, we just have to pass in an object. Now we want to make sure that we set up the required fields. So the first one that we want is the query key. Now, if you're wondering what a query key is, this is what is going to be used by React Query to internally cache your data mapped by the query key itself. There are other things that you can do with the query key. Later on, you'll see other examples, such as when we want to invalidate a query, which means you're going into the React Query's state and you're looking at this query key that maps to this API call. And then you want to invalidate that query key, which is essentially just going to refetch the data because that data could be stale. And you want to make sure that you are doing that appropriately to ensure that you do not have stale data in your application. So those are two examples of what query keys can be used for. So in my case, what I'm going to do is we're going to be fetching a list of users. So I'm going to call this query key get users. You can call it whatever you want. Okay. And I'm also going to rename this variable to get users. Now, what's important now is we also want to make sure that our query actually calls an API. So we need to define a query function. And this query function is a wrapper around your API call. So the function that calls your API, whether it's axios.get or the built-in browser's fetch API, whatever it is, the query function is going to wrap around this API call that you're making. So what I'm going to do is, let me just remove this. I'm going to create a new file. Let's create a folder first. Let's call it utils. I'll call it api.ts. And we're going to just create our functions in here and then import here. So I want to create a few functions, or I'll create one for now. And I'll call this get users equals and then async. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use the fetch API. And for my mock data, I'm going to use something called JSON placeholder, which is this right over here. And this is a good way to create just demo apps. You can use this to get fake data. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use the user's endpoint right over here. So fetch, just like that. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is remember that the fetch API, we need to make sure that we are taking the response, so this res variable, and we want to make sure that we are calling the appropriate method that we want to transform data to. So for example, if it's a JSON response, we want to do res.json like this, right? Now, right now, it's going to try to, I don't know why I try to do that automatically, but I want to do res.json, whoops, like this. Oh, I forgot to, oh wait, no wonder why. I forgot about that. Okay, wonderful. So don't forget to await the fetch call because fetch returns a promise. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to return res.json, which also returns a promise. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this getUsers function and I'm going to map it to this query function field right over here. So what will happen is this getUsers, what's going on over here, block scoped. Oh, it's because these are the same thing. Let's see. For now, I'll just rename this to getUsers query. It's not going to matter because we're going to eventually destructure fields from this object anyways, so I'm just going to rename it to this. Okay, so now what we just did was we set the query function to be this getUsers function. So React Query will invoke this query function, which is going to invoke this getUsers function. Now, what happens internally is it's going to make this fetch request. It's going to go ahead and if it's successful and if there's data, it's going to call res.json. And then what will happen is it's going to save that JSON data internally. It's going to manage that state for us internally. And if I console log getUsers query, you're going to see that there's going to be a bunch of fields that will appear. And you can already see that things are happening as I go to the screen. If I refresh, you'll see that over here that the dev tools indicate that getUsers was called. But let me open up the network tab. I'm going to refresh the page. You'll see that the users endpoint is immediately invoked. It's automatically done by itself as the component is being rendered. Pretty straightforward. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit more. And if I look at the console, you'll see that I have all of these fields that are on that returned object from the use query call. You can see that the important one here is data because we have an array of users. That's the data that is coming from the API. We have error, which is null there because there's no errors. We have, let's see, we have is success true. We also have this refetch field, which is a function, which we'll talk more about later when it comes to refetching data. Okay, but hopefully this makes sense. We also have is loading, which is currently false. But if I go to previous versions of the object, you'll see that right over here is, let's see, is loading true. Is loading is true, or is loading now false. Data is populated, and then, yeah, and then it gets to this final stage over here. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward, and you can use the dev tools to debug. So you can see over here that for this query, I can see my data and I can see all of the items over here. And this is actually pretty cool because you can even modify the data as well, which is really awesome. You can invalidate it, which we'll talk more about later. You can refetch it manually, remove it, a whole bunch of things. Now, since we are using TypeScript, one more thing that I do want to do is show you how we can type annotate our use query call. So I'm going to create a new file, call it types.ts. And I'm going to go ahead and type annotate this use query function, which is generic. Because right now, if I reference getUsers query.data, the inferred type is any. And if I try to reference the variable or the field, then nothing's going to appear. We don't have any intel sense because TypeScript doesn't know this data type. Okay, so let's go ahead and create one. So for the users endpoint from the JSON placeholder API, it has a bunch of fields right over here. You can see we have ID, name, username, email. I am not going to have all of the fields defined because we have nested objects like address and then geo and then company. I'm just going to keep it simple and just do ID, name, username, and email because those are the only fields that I'm going to be referencing anyways. But if you have more, of course, make sure you define them. So let's go ahead and call this, let's see, export interface. Let's do users or user data. You can call it user response HTTP data if you want. But I'll leave it like that. I'll actually leave it like this instead of just user data. I want to be more specific. Okay, and then we're going to do ID, which is a number, name, which is a string, username, which is a string, and email, which is a string. Of course, if you wanted to define or add the field for address, you just need to create another type for address, or you can just do it inside over here as well. But we're going to leave it like this for now, just to keep it simple. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to type annotate this use query hook. So we need angle brackets. And I'm going to import user response HTTP data. And remember that this is an array of users, so we're going to specify it with a pair of square brackets. And now if I hover over data, you can see that we have user response HTTP data, or an array of user response HTTP data. And that's the type annotation for this data field over here. And I can reference the map function if I wanted to return or render all of these users to the document. Okay, so why don't we do this? Let's now destructure some of those fields as I mentioned earlier. So we're going to destructure data, error, and is loading. These are the three most common fields that you will be using. And because you'll have multiple queries later on in one component, you may want to consider renaming these destructured fields. So for example, you might want to rename data to users data, error to users error, and then is loading to, let's see, is users loading. Because like I said, we're going to be setting up another query later for fetching posts. And if we are destructuring the fields from the object, we want to make sure we are renaming the fields as well. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do this. Let's show you a practical example of fetching data, checking to see if there are any errors, checking the status of the loading field, and then rendering the data when we're in a valid state. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll check to see if there are any errors and if we're not loading. So let's do if error or if users error, and if is users loading is false. So basically that means the API request either has been canceled or it was completed, but there was an error. So we're going to go ahead and do return. Let's do a div. An error has occurred while fetching users. Okay, cool. So this will handle that case. Now let's see. Let's go ahead and try to actually get that to occur. So if I go into api.ts, now again, if this server were to actually return a 500, which let's see if they actually do have any. I want to see if this mock server has any responses that give back a 500. I don't think they do from what I've seen last time. But it's okay. What we'll do instead is we'll just go ahead and manually throw an error over here. So I'll go ahead and just do return promise.reject error. Okay, and now we should see this error appearing on the screen, or the this message appearing on the screen. If I go into the browser now, let's refetch. So if I go into the browser, you can see that the error is appearing, but let me refresh the page or refresh the page. So the network request is happening, it's succeeding. Okay, and now you can see that it took some time for the error to appear. And you can see that it also tried to make multiple requests. So this is the retry mechanism that's happening, okay? Because the wrapper function, that query function, is returning an error. It's throwing an error. And it took a while for this message to appear. The reason why it did is because it didn't resolve into an error state immediately. It retried multiple times. And you can see that if I were to console log, this is users loading variable. You can see that initially it's going to go into a true state. Okay. And because we're checking to see if it's not false, which is what will cause this error message to appear, it's not going to render that error message immediately. You can see now the state of is users loading goes into false, which the negation of that is going to make this entire conditional statement true. And that's why we get this div over here. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense on why it took a little bit. But I think there should actually be, let's see. There should be some information over here. Yep, there you go. Perfect. Fetch failure count 4 times. Error update count 2 times. If I refresh the page right now, and if I click on this query, we can see that fetch failure count 3, 4, and then we updated the error 1 time. So React Query doesn't automatically update the error object immediately. It's going to try to refetch on failure multiple times. I believe the max by default is 4, though you could probably change that. There should be ways that you can change that, which is, again, pretty freaking cool if you ask me. And if you look at the network tab, 1 API call, 2 API calls, 3 API calls, 4 API calls, done. Now, again, remember, the API call here is successful, but you have to understand that it's what matters the most is this function over here and what we are returning, whether we are returning a promise that resolves or a promise that rejects. That is the reason why the API call succeeds, but we're still in an error state. Okay, so if I remove this, or if I just undo all this and do that again, you'll see now, refresh the page, you will see that right over here. Where is it? You'll see that data update count 1. Let's see. Error update count 0. No error. Okay. If I were to add that, let's go back here again. Promise.reject. Just do that. You'll see right over here. It's going to try one more time. You're going to see that data update count 0. It never updated the data because we were in an error state. All right, so hopefully this is all pretty cool because now you can see the power of React Query. But let's go ahead and do another thing. Let's go down over here and let's render out the users. So we want to make sure that we're checking to see if we are not in a loading state. So we'll do if is users is not loading. Let's see, and users data. Then we'll go ahead and do div, and then we'll render the users. So we'll do users data dot map, and then we'll do user, another div. Right now everything looks pretty ugly. That's because I don't have this ternary opera completed. Let me use my formatter prettier. Which is the format that I'm using in case if you're wondering. I'm using prettier. And I'm going to go ahead and render out the user. So I'll just do, let's do user dot name. Let's do username, whoops. And let's do email, like that. And then let's set the key to be the user's ID. Okay, and then of course, if either of this is false, we can just go ahead and do loading for now. Let me actually fix this. There we go. Whoops. There we go. And last div. Okay. Cool. So let's refresh. Let me minimize this for a little bit. You can kind of see that if I refresh fast enough, you'll see that that loading does appear over there. All right. So now you know how to query data, get data from a server with React Query. Now let's go ahead and talk about mutations and show you how we can actually create data or post data with React Query. So what exactly is a mutation? So you might as well understand what this term means, because if you're using Apollo, if you're using Redux Toolkit, React Query, they all use the same term mutation. And all mutation means is just mutating data, hence the word mutation, or modifying data, creating data. So any post request, patch request, put request, etc., those are examples of a mutation. Okay? You're going to hear that term all the time, so that's why I am mentioning it to you right now. So in our case, if we wanted to make a post request to create a post, we would need to perform a mutation. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's first set up a form. So I'm going to not render these users anymore. So I'll just go ahead and comment all of this out right over here. And I'll leave the code here so that way you all can reference it later. It's all going to be in a GitHub repository, don't worry. But what I'm going to do is let's set up a quick form. And this is just basic stuff, so I assume that you all should know how to do this already. So we'll set up a very informal form. I'm not going to use the form tags, but we'll do input, then we'll do a break, a line break, and then another input. And then let's go ahead and let's set the name. This will be the title, ID title, and then name body, ID body. So this will be the title of the post, and this will be the body of the post, so the contents. Okay, and we do need to make sure we define some state for both the title and the body input fields. So up top over here, I'm going to use the useState hook. So we'll do one for the title, title, set title equals useState. And then we'll do the same thing for body and set body. Perfect. Now let's go back down over here and let's bind the title state variable to the appropriate input field, which is this first one over here. And then we're going to attach an on-change event listener. So when we are typing in this field, we're going to go ahead and update the states of title by calling set title. So we're going to need the event argument. And we're going to go ahead and call set title and then pass in event.target.value, which is the value of the form field. And we're going to use that to update the state of title. We're going to do the same exact thing for the body form field. I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to change it to body, and then set body. Again, pretty straightforward stuff. You should already know how to do stuff like this, but hopefully my explanation, although it was quick, makes sense. Simple form, 2 input fields, you get the idea. Okay, let's just make sure our form is good. Okay, and you know what? Let me add a label as well. Let's do title. Title, label, and then body. Okay, there we go. Perfect. All right, and now let's add a button down over here. Or I'll call this create post. And you know what? Actually, I think I might use a form tag instead, because I think it would be better, because what I can do is I can use the onSubmit event to handle the submission of the form. So in other words, we're going to have that onSubmit function that's going to be called, make the API call to the post endpoint to create the post. Okay. All right. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and set up our mutation. So we're going to go ahead and import the useMutation hook. Okay. And then similar to the useQuery hook, we just call the useMutation hook just like this. And then we need to pass some options, but remember that this useMutation hook does return an object as well, which we will destructure later. But what I want to do is I want to pass in the object into useMutation, and we need to pass in a query function. Not sure why. Oh, I guess it's a mutation function is the name, not query function. Sorry about that. So we need to pass in a mutation function field. And this is just similar to the query function, except this is just named mutation function. It's just going to be a wrapper around our API call. Okay. So I'm going to go into api.ts, and we're going to go ahead and make a network request to this endpoint right over here. let's see. Yep. So post right over here. Okay. So this JSON placeholder server supports this post request endpoint. It's not going to actually add a post to the server. It's just going to pretend like it's going to do it. But that's okay for now. So let's go ahead and create a function called create post. Okay. And because we are going to send data to the server, we want to make sure that this function accepts an argument, which is going to contain the request payload, the request body that is sent to the fake API server. So that request body is going to have 3 fields. It's going to have the title, body, and the user ID. That's how it's defined on the server itself. If you look over here, you can see that when they make a post request to the post endpoint, they pass title, body, and user ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and let me get back to this use mutation hook in just a bit. I'm going to go into types.ts. We're going to create a new interface called this create post request body. And then we need the title, string, body, string, and then user ID number. I'm going to go ahead and now pass an argument to create post. I'll just call this body and then type annotate it with that new interface that we just created. And then now we're going to go ahead and call the posts endpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable called res, similar to the top over here on line 4. We're going to go ahead and await the fetch call, and I'm just going to copy this URL. And you know what, let me just do this, const base API URL. And let me just kind of like refactor this real quick. Users, because we're going to be reusing this anyways. So right over here, let's do base API URL and then posts. And then because we're making a post request, we need to pass in this object, which is just some options. We're going to set the method to post. For the request body, we're going to need to use the JSON.stringify function and then pass in the body object, just like this. Okay, and then we can also set the headers as well. Content type application / JSON character set or char set UTF-8. Okay, and remember that when we await this API call, this is going to return the response, and we want to get the JSON response, so we can just do return res.json like this. So now let's go back to our use mutation hook. Let's continue setting up this mutation function, and you can also use a mutation key as well. Okay, so for the mutation function, we're going to have this call the create post method. We're going to wrap the create post method. So now in order for us to call our mutation, we want to reference mutation like this. And then we're going to go ahead and call the mutate function right over here like that. And then we have to pass in that object, which is the create post request body, as an argument to that function. And then it's going to make that API call. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let's actually do it. So I'm going to go ahead and destructure some fields from the mutation object. So first we'll destructure mutate. I'm going to call this, let's do create post. Maybe I can rename this. Let's do create post mutation. Okay, and then there are other fields as well. We have is success, is pending, is error. There should be an error object as well. I'm probably not going to worry about is error and error, but I do want to worry about is success, and I'll explain to you later on why. I'll remove is pending as well. So we'll just destructure these two for now. And let me rename this to is create post success to be consistent. Okay, so we're going to go into our form. And since we are using a form and we have a button inside this form, when I click on this button, you'll see that it's going to go ahead and do the default browser behavior, which it looks like it's refreshing the page. We don't want that. So we're going to fix that right now. So on the onSubmit event listener, the first thing that we're going to do is pass in this function right over here. We're going to call event.prevent default to prevent that default behavior of that. I'll show you, of that refresh. That it looks like it's refreshing, but it's really just forwarding the data to the defined path, which we don't have it defined, but calling event.prevent default will fix that and prevent it from doing like a quote unquote refresh. Okay. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and call create post mutation, and now we're just gonna pass in the argument, which is an object. So we need the title and the body, and because the field names are going to be the same, or they are the same as our state variable names, we can just do this instead of just doing title, and then body like that. We still need the user ID though, and for additional context, obviously, if your application has authentication, which I would assume it does if you are creating posts, which should be a protected endpoint, your user ID is going to be the logged in user, so you would grab it however you need to. So let's say if you are using JSON web tokens, and if you have that value decoded on the client side, you would have the user's ID right there and then saved in, let's say, some context, right? Like React context. So that's just an example. Obviously, we don't have authentication, so I'm just going to define a user ID up top over here. We'll call this, let's do 45889. Okay. Just some random number. And then we'll do user ID. All right. So that should be pretty much it. This function returns void. It doesn't return a promise. Doesn't return anything. So let's go over here. Let's go into the browser. And I'm going to go ahead and open the network tab first, and I'll show you what happens. So if I just pass some data here, if I click create post, you're going to see that now the API call was made to the post endpoint. We get a 201, and the preview or the payload, we can see that our data is being sent to the server correctly. And then we can see the preview right over here, and we have the response right over here. Now remember, the server doesn't actually add the data, it just simulates it. If I click create post again, it's just going to have the same ID of the post. This is the ID of the post. Now, if we look into the dev tools, you'll see that if I click on mutations, you'll see that it happens right over here twice. We made 2 mutations, and you can look at the debug information right over here. You can see all of that stuff happening, which is great. So now I want to go back into our code, and I want to explain a little bit about what happens or what should happen when you create a mutation or when you perform a mutation. Because right now you need to understand that if you are not using React Query and you are using just regular fetch or Axios to make an API call, and then you're managing the state yourself. Let's say you have a blogging application. You want the user to be able to create the post, have the server create it in the database, and then return a response. And then on the client side, you want to make sure that that new post that was created appears in the document to the user without having to have them manually refresh the page. It has to happen asynchronously without any page refreshes, right? Now, if you weren't using React Query, and if you're just doing it the forced way, which is you take the response from the post request. So let's say, for example, I take this response right over here, title, body, user ID, and ID, and I take this post response and I add it to the array that is managing my state of posts that was initially fetched from the beginning. So remember, I fetched an array of posts, I save it into some state, and now every single time I create a new post, I'm going to, instead of fetching the data again for non-stale data, instead of fetching for new data from the server, which will include the new created post on the server, assuming that you are calling it at the right time. Instead of doing that, you are trying to manage it on the client side, which is going to cause a lot of havoc. Okay, and that's why React Query exists, because in standard practice, you don't want to actually modify your state manually on the client side by adding that post to that array of posts by yourself. You just want to fetch the data again and then have React Query take care of all the state management for you. and then it'll just render to the document with the new post. And if you have any pagination, that will apply accordingly as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so this is where refetching the data is important. So after my mutation occurs, I want to make sure that I have the latest post appearing in the document. Now, remember, in this case, there's no way that we can actually add the data to the fake server because it doesn't actually add it. So the important thing here is, though, is to see the API call being made when we finish our mutation. Okay, now what API call am I talking about? Like, what API call should be called after the mutation? Well, that's up to you to decide, because you have to sit down and think, okay, well, if I perform this mutation, I'm creating data, I'm updating data, I'm deleting data, what on my user interface is going to need to be changed without needing to refresh the page? So in our case, right now, we aren't fetching posts and we're not rendering posts. But you know what? Let's actually quickly do that. Okay? Because to answer the question, what needs to happen is we need to fetch the posts again. So that way we don't have stale data anymore on the client side. So if I create a new post, that assumes that our data now is no longer brand new. It is stale. So we want to refetch the API for a fresh batch of data. Okay? Before we do that, let's just quickly create a query for posts. So that should be pretty straightforward. Let's do get post equals async. And then I'm just going to copy this. The endpoint is just /posts. And we're done. I should also create a type annotation for this. So the endpoint for posts should just be the ID, title, body, and user ID. So I will go ahead and create an interface, call it post response HTTP data. And so we need the ID, which is a number, title string, body string, and then user ID number. Okay, now let's go back here, and I'm going to just copy all this, paste down here, and I'm going to just rename everything to post. So let's see if I can do that over here. Posts data, posts error, and then right over here, we're going to rename this to is posts loading. And then we're going to change the type annotation from user response HTTP data to posts response HTTP data. Let's make sure that imports up top over here. And remember, it's an array. And we're going to change the query key to get posts. And the query function is now going to be get posts as well. And make sure that is imported up top there as well. Wonderful. Wonderful. All right, so let's just make sure before we continue, everything is working correctly. You can see that the get post query is working. And we have our data right over here. It's fetching a lot, which is good. And now, let's actually render our posts. So let me go ahead and maybe I'll do it down below here. And I'll do is posts loading if it's not loading. And if is posts, do I have the data? Oh, post data. And post data. Then what I'll do is I'll render post data. Okay, so post. Let's set up a div. And then we're going to go ahead and use an h1 tag for the title. And then for the body, we'll use a paragraph tag just like that. And then let's set a key. Let's set the key to be the post ID. And we're not going to do anything with the user ID. But that's pretty much the author. So now I have all of my posts right over here. Okay, wonderful. So now that we have our post being rendered, our example is practical. So right now, if I create a post, all it's just going to do is just call the API. That's it. But remember, I created a post. Now we're going to pretend like the server actually added the post. And now we need a fresh batch of posts. We need new data because this post data that is on the client side right now is stale. It is old data. Okay. So let's go ahead and show you how to refetch the data. There's two ways that you can do it, and I'm going to show you both ways. So right now what I'm going to do is up top over here, you may have recalled earlier that I mentioned something about the refetch function, and that's what we're going to use right now. So we're not going to use it for the users, but we're going to use it for the posts. So we're going to go ahead and add this refetch function. We're going to destructure it, but we're going to rename it to refetch get posts. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And let's go ahead and do this. We need to call this function now. Okay. Now you're wondering, okay, where should we call it? Should I call it after I call create post mutation? Well, we can try. Let's see what happens. So we have our users, we have our posts. Let's go ahead and create a post now. Okay. Now, I don't want to actually say it right away, but if I just show you what you see over here, like if I just click between these two tabs over here, because these requests are supposed to happen in order. Okay. But if I click on this right now, look at the request method. And then if I click on this one, look at the post method. And again, these are supposed to be in order. Why is it making a get request first and then making the post request? Because this get request is the refetch one. This post request is what causes the refetch to happen. So hopefully you can see what is going on. And this is a known example of kind of like a race condition, right? And this is why you don't want to call refetch get post or whatever your refetch function name is. Whatever that refetch function is, you don't want to call it after you call create post mutation, because you're assuming that everything is happening synchronously. You're assuming that all of the state is being updated and then we are refetching the data. No. When you call create post mutation, it is just making that API call and then it is asynchronously updating the data. So you're not guaranteed to actually have the state updated in time for you to refetch the posts. Okay, so I do not recommend you do that. Again, if I refresh the page right now, you can see that right over here, it is making that get request. And maybe in some cases, it might make the 201 call. Yep, in this case right over here, it made the post request first, and then it made the get request. In some cases, that will happen, right? Of course, again, it's like a race condition. Which one happens first? Which one resolves first? Okay, if we look at the dev tools, let's see. Well, we do see that it is performing the mutation. That's fine. But the network tab does give us a good insight of what's going on. So let's not call that refetch function in here. So now where do we call it then? Well, what we want to do, and this is why I mentioned the isSuccess field earlier from the useMutation return object. The isSuccess mutation allows us to know when the mutation is successful. And this is a great place for us to actually make the API call or do the refetch of the post once the mutation is successful. So what we can do is we can use a useEffect hook. We can add a dependency array that includes the isCreatePostSuccess field. So that way, when this changes, we know to rerun the side effect. And then what we can do is, let me just do this console log isCreatePostSuccess. Or well, actually, let me do this. We need to check to see if this is truthy. And then we're going to refetch the data. Because we only want to refetch if this is successful. And then we also want to make sure that we add this refetch get post function as a dependency array. In case of anything changes in here, we want to have we want all of the closures to be updated as well. So now let's go back here. Let's refresh. Let's now create the post. So now every single time I create a post, it's making that 201 call first, and then it's making the 200. Okay, you can see that first it goes into a pending state, and only when it resolves, it then immediately refetches that data again. So this is the proper way to do it. Okay, you want to make sure you're doing it after the mutation is successful. If you want to add an additional check, you can also add the isPending field, destructured from this useMutation return object. I'm going to rename this to isCreatePostPending. And this basically goes into a pending state if the API call is still executing. You can see over here, true if the mutation is currently executing. And so what you can do is you can add this in the use effect, and you can go ahead and add an additional check. So if the create post mutation is successful and we're not in a pending state, then you can refresh or refetch, sorry. So let's go ahead and go back to the network tab. We have our initial API calls, create post, 201 and then the 200. Okay, and there we go. Everything is working just fine. Now, the other way that I want to show you how to refetch data, it's known as invalidating queries. So what this means is, in a nutshell, the end goal is that it's going to go ahead and refetch the data, but you're using a query key to invalidate the query that's in the cache. Because remember, React Query caches your data, and by invalidating your query, you're taking a query key and you're saying, hey, whatever query key this maps to, I want that data to be refetched. I want that data to no longer be in a stale state. I want to fetch new data again. Okay. So remember the query client that we instantiated in the main.tsx file. So since we passed inside the provider, and since our app is inside the query client provider, we can use the use query client hook, and we can use this to grab the query client instance because it's in the context. So let's do const query client equals use query client. And then what I'm going to do now is, instead of calling refetch get posts, let me remove that as a dependency array. From the dependency array, I'm going to do query client dot, and we'll do invalidate queries. And then we're going to go ahead and pass an object, and we're going to set the query key to be the one that we want to invalidate. So remember that our get posts query over here has this query key get posts like that. So I'm going to paste that over here, and now it's going to go ahead and invalidate this query key right over here, which will essentially refetch the data for our posts. Now we also need to make sure that we're adding query client as a dependency array, since we are using the invalidate queries method call. So watch what happens if I go back to the browser. Let's go ahead and go to the network tab. And again, you can see the same exact thing happens. It makes that post request and then makes that get request to get the new set of posts. Same thing, 201, 200, 201, 200. Now, if you wanted to, for some reason, refetch the user's data as well, you can also do that. So what I can do additionally is I can also invalidate the get users query as well. Now remember, invalidate queries is it's asynchronous. It returns a promise. If you need to wait for one query to finish invalidating before invalidating another, you can just await this or use .then.catch. But I can easily invalidate the user's query without needing to wait for get post to finish. So I'll invalidate get users. So now when I create a post, it's going to make a request to get the new set of posts and then the new set of users, as you can see over here. Now, one more way that I want to show you how we can actually invalidate the query when the mutation is successful is, instead of using a use effect hook, you can also go over here inside this object, and you can actually set this on success function right over here, and you can just move everything up top over here. So you have flexibility. You can either use the on success function, you can use a use effect hook, you can use whichever one you want. But I want to show you multiple examples just so that you understand what's going on. And the same thing will happen, right? I can just do on success. And let's show you what happens. There you go. You can see that on success, and then we have our data. Okay, we have 201 and then the 200 and then the 200. Okay. Now, one more thing that I do want to also address as well is that if you're using the fetch API, you have to remember that it's not going to actually throw an error if the response from the server is a 400 or a 500. So what you actually need to do to check to see if the response was valid from the server, so if they return a 200 or a 300 as an example, right? You have to check this response.ok property. Okay, so here's what I'll do. I'll log the OK and then status. And if you look at the get users query, it's going to say true 200 because that's where we're logging right over here. But if I were to change the URL to something that is not valid, you'll see that I get false 404. Okay, and again, remember, if you use the fetch API, you have to handle this case by yourself. If you use Axios, Axios will take care of it for you because Axios will actually reject, it'll throw an error if the status code is 400 or 500. Okay, so what we can do in this case is we can check to see if res.ok is true. Then we can return res.json. And if it's not, I can just do return. I wonder if they have, I guess, their own error method. Nope. We can just do return promise.reject. And then we'll just do res.status. That. Okay. And if I refresh now, you'll see that we get 404 not found. But again, remember, React query is still going to try to fetch that data. Let's see, why is it still fetching data? Oh, there you go, it's null. Okay, error 404, fetch failure count 4, and then fetch failure reason 404. So hopefully all of this made sense. I just wanted to show a very simple tutorial example on how to get your foot in the door with React Query. Of course, there are a ton of more features that React Query can take care of for you. I urge you to go on the React Query documentation, check it out, scroll through the entire sidebar. There's a lot of things that React Query can do for you. I will see you all in my next video. Peace out.